Shortly after the expulsion of the Tarquin dynasty and the foundation of the Republic, the Romans swore a solemn oath that they would never again be governed by a king. This defining event in the history of Western Europe is remarkable because the Romans had realized that the problem was not simply the tyranny of the current king. Rather, they had come to the radical conclusion that monarchy itself was fundamentally flawed, and that absolute power had a corrupting influence on any man who wielded it. Perhaps they would have agreed with the assessment of the French Jacobin leader Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, who famously said that no one can reign innocently. But after the fervor of revolution dissipated, the downtrodden plebeians grew discontent under a regime that promised them little in the way of political opportunity and even less informal protections from the depredations of the wealthy patricians. With no constitutional method for effecting change, the plebeians embraced a bold political tactic: secession. The plebs undertook a massive general strike that saw them all abscond from the city and refused to lift a finger for the patricians, even forsaking their obligation to enlist in the army to defend Rome from its enemies. It wasn't long before the patrician minority realized that Rome was nothing without its people, and worked toward a reconciliation. These proceedings alarmed the Senate, and it sent out those of its older members who were most reasonably disposed towards the people to treat with them. The chief spokesman was Manius Agrippa, and after much entreaty of the people and much plain speaking in behalf of the Senate, he concluded his discourse with a celebrated fable. He said, namely, that all the other members of man's body once revolted against the belly, and accused it of being the only member to sit idly down in its place and make no contribution to the common welfare, while the rest underwent great hardships and performed great public services only to minister to its appetites, but that the belly laughed at their simplicity in not knowing that it received into it all the body's nourishment, only to send it back again and duly distribute it among the other members. Such, then, said again, is the relation of the Senate, my fellow citizens, to you. The matters for deliberation, which there receive the necessary attention and disposition, bring to you all, and severally, what is useful and helpful. Agrippa's efforts were ultimately successful, and though Plutarch would have us believe that it was his parable of the belly that won the plebeians back, the admission that immediately after the succession the tribunate was established to safeguard plebeian interests indicates that Agrippa's little story was accompanied by actual material concessions on the part of the Senate. Indeed, it's hard to imagine that anyone could be won over by a parable as blatantly self-serving as Agrippa's. Plutarch may want us to believe that the plebeian rabble were held in thrall by the powerful oratory of a great man, but it's difficult to believe that a group engaged in a bitter class struggle like this, and especially one that had shown such remarkable solidarity to force significant concessions, would be hoodwinked so easily. But the sad reality of Rome is that eventually all Roman citizens, patrician and plebeian alike, slowly began to accept the core tenets of this story, to believe that there was an elevated class which was entitled to the fruits of others' labor and was tasked with offering little more than supposedly benevolent guidance in return. The class conflict that had roiled the early republic would soon dissipate, as foreign conquests made it possible to seize the land and wealth of outsiders. First, the surrounding Italian communities became subject to Roman overlordship, and later, the entire Mediterranean would fall under its sway. This continued expansion helped Roman aristocrats foster a sense of unity among patricians and plebeians through appeals to patriotism. But the distribution of the stolen wealth of the conquered also helped mollify the more radical plebeian demands for a greater share in the republic's wealth. Of course, the lion's share of the loot went to the well-connected patricians and their clients, but by providing a pittance of these ill-gotten gains to plebeian soldiers, their loyalty was also secured. But there was another benefit to the continued provincial expansion: the creation of a permanent underclass of non-citizen allies with limited rights, and then later the domination of subject provincials with none at all. This, of course, offered very little in the way of material benefits to the poor plebeians, but they could take pride in the fact that they now stood at a comparatively higher rung on the Roman social pyramid, not because their lot had actually improved, but because there were now even more people below them. Then as now, the creation of a hyper-exploited underclass served to strip the poor of earlier radicalism and even internal solidarity, meaning that the wealthy were the true beneficiaries. But though the Republic's growing empire offered tangible benefits to the individuals at the apex of Roman society, the addition of new territory to Rome's domains also placed tremendous stress on the practical workings of politics. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. After the expulsion of the Tarquins, Rome had adopted a mixed constitution that was designed to balance monarchic, aristocratic, and democratic elements to provide long-term stability and prevent any single individual from seizing sole control. The Greek writer Polybius viewed this system, known colloquially as the mos maiorum, as the ideal constitution, and America's founding fathers also believed it provided an excellent model. However, when the mos maiorum took shape, Rome was just a typical Italian city-state and controlled no more than 20 kilometers in any direction from the city. The Rome of the early Republic was poor, agriculture was the dominant trade, and even owning slaves was a luxury. The initial governing norms of the Republic reflected this, and though the shape of the government was to change with the addition of the tribunes of the Plebs and the codification of the 12 tables, by and large the actual magistracies, as well as their powers and responsibilities, remained consistent with how they were outlined according to the mos maiorum. This meant that they were designed for the governing of a small city-state, and became increasingly ineffective at tackling the problems that emerged as Rome's power and influence grew. The increasing tension caused by these fundamental contradictions nonetheless remained manageable under the existing order until after the conclusion of the First Punic War, when Rome added Sicily as its first overseas province. Though clearly identified with Italy today, 2,200 years ago, Romans regarded Sicily as a baffling island of Greeks and Phoenicians, meaning that it was far too foreign to be integrated into the system of allies and dependencies that Rome had used to enforce its hegemony while still allowing for limited self-rule of its conquests within the Italian peninsula. Sicily was instead to be ruled as a completely subject territory, directly overseen by Roman magistrates and lacking the threadbare protections and rights to which allied communities were entitled. Furthermore, while allied communities were only required to provide soldiers to fight alongside the legions, Sicily paid taxes directly to Rome, the first of many such Roman provinces to be forced to pay for the privilege of their own occupation. Managing this territory and the other provinces which were soon annexed by Rome required the invention of a new office, the provincial governor. This marked a seismic shift in Republican politics, as the Romans recognized for the first time that the mos maiorum was inadequate for the task of governing an empire. The principles that the Republic espoused, such as the limited power of its magistrates and the collegial system that prevented power from being concentrated in a single man, were born out of their hatred of monarchical despotism, but these were disregarded in the creation of the offices of proconsul and propraetor. The provincial governors would be men who ruled their subjects as tyrants with little accountability. Granted, the Romans would not have seen the contradiction here. The mos maiorum was intended to protect citizens and the Republic itself from the capricious whims of an absolute monarch, and those who weren't citizens were not entitled to the protections of Rome's unwritten constitution. But the long-term command that these men had over military forces, as well as their license to accrue obscene wealth by looting the provinces during their term, placed them in a position outside the Roman constitutional order. Unfortunately, the stress that this put on the republican system could be easily disregarded, as each senator or equestrian salivated over the prospect of a lucrative provincial position or contract. Individual gain trumped tradition, as the Republic slowly withered away under the weight of countless small compromises that each Roman made with an eye to their own advancement or advantage. As Rome accumulated ever more provincial holdings and the rewards of conquest and exploitation became more lucrative, Competition amongst the elite for these plum positions heightened conflict between political factions, resulting in petty obstructionism, unprecedented bribery, and even bloodshed in the streets of Rome. High-interest loans were taken out for the expensive campaign bribes, and the immense financial rewards that accompanied high office, coupled with the possible destitution that awaited potential losers, greatly increased the gap between the upper strata of the Roman elite and their senatorial peers. Accordingly, the scope of provincial governorships grew, and postings were extended beyond the traditional one-year term. Pompey's extraordinary Eastern command set the precedent for this, but the trend reached its zenith in Caesar acquiring the governorships of 3 different provinces for 5 whole years after his term as consul. Using the extraordinary latitude which provincial governors were granted, Caesar invaded Gaul on a flimsy pretext for the sole purpose of increasing his own wealth and influence. When the Senate refused to condone the war, Caesar simply raised his own troops and paid them himself. Little surprise, then, that these soldiers were loyal to their commander and not the Republic itself. Soon, Pompey and Crassus would both receive similar long-term provincial commands, meaning that the provinces were now really nothing but petty kingdoms for warlords. When civil war erupted in 49, both sides claimed to be fighting under the banner of the Republic, but the troops of Pompey and Caesar each had a vested interest in seeing that it was their commander who came out on top and fought to secure his one-man rule. Despite their stated intentions, the cause of Republican liberty took a back seat to naked ambition and private gain. We must be clear that attributing the end of the Republic to the increasing extra-constitutional power of its magistrates is not simply a case of 20/20 hindsight allowing us moderns to perceive how the culmination of disparate trends contributed to Republican collapse. Even contemporary Romans, like the historian Sallust, were putting the pieces together before the Republic actually fell. Sallust noted that the rapid expansion of territory and sudden influx of slaves and treasure was destabilizing to the governing norms and institutions of the Republic, as well as the mos maiorum. Sallust lived to see consuls replaced by dictators, and then later the triumvir who would become the princeps, bringing Rome the monarchist absolutism that every citizen loathed in theory, but not in practice. So long as the monarch was coy about his power or used different terminology to conceal his true position, Romans had no issues with monarchism. It is traditionally stated that the Republic was a victim of its own success, but in reality, it was Republican political thought which slowly yielded to the imperial prerogative of control. The fundamental calculus had shifted. Liberty mattered less than the authoritarianism required to enable exploitation, and the relative prosperity that came with it. The foundational values of the Republic could not be reconciled with its empire, and so the Republic withered. Its erosion took generations and was so gradual that we can't even place a definitive date on its death. But before we condemn the Romans for their short-sightedness or willingness to place material gains above lofty political principles, we must ask if 2,000 years later we are really any different. The Romans, in keeping with the values of their times, unabashedly embraced imperialism. They could not understand that imperialism isn't something that simply happens abroad, but rather it has a corrosive effect on domestic liberties and freedoms. What the colonizer sows, he must one day reap. For imperialism is often sold domestically as a win-win scenario. The metropole will gain access to new markets on favorable terms and will be positioned to exploit the subjects by siphoning off treasure and resources. But in reality, the relationship is far more complex than the domination of one population. There are negative consequences of imperialism, even for the colonizing society. For eventually, the tactics of domination and repression that are developed to keep distant subjects in line find their way back, a principle that Foucault dubbed the boomerang effect. The post-colonial theorist Aimé Césaire also addresses the root problems with the logic of imperialism in his Discourse on Colonialism. No one colonizes innocently. No one colonizes with impunity either. A nation which colonizes, a civilization which justifies colonization, and therefore force, is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which irresistibly, progressing from one consequence to another, one denial to another, calls for its punishment. Then as now, policies that were developed to maintain control in far-flung colonies and amongst subject populations eventually found their way home. Regimes first and foremost desire control, and when domestic populations accept the subjugation of some, they implicitly open the door toward the subjugation of all. For modern parallels, one must look no further than the increasing militarization of police in the United States, as well as their growing latitude to repress domestic undesirables in the same manner that the military crushes popular movements abroad. But across the West, even those that aren't engaged in political activism are subject to a growing surveillance state that collects data and recordings of private citizens with impunity. To escape this bind, we must make a leap that the Romans were never capable of: to show radical solidarity, not just domestically, but to recognize the connections between foreign exploitation and internal subjugation. As tempting as it is to accrue the economic benefits of neocolonialism while denying its impacts, we must renounce the logic of Agrippa's parable of the belly and recognize that no one is entitled to the labor or wealth of another. The simple truth is that no one is free until all of us are free. In signing off on the exploitation of others, we not only sell our souls, but we sell the liberty we claim to cherish.